right, well, it looks like we've got a fair number of people here and we have just passed the 11:30 mark, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome. It's so nice to see so many of you here. My name is Lizzie Alwan. I'm a graduate student in the Public Policy and Administration program here at UMass Amherst, and I am very lucky to be the president of the UMass ICMA chapter. I'm joined here today by our vice president, Benjamin Gross, our treasurer, James Robinson, and our communications director, Courtney Fallon, should be joining us shortly. And we are so delighted to welcome you to the Future of Work and Government panel. So before we get started, I'd like to thank our panelists for taking the time to share your expertise with us. We have 4 experts in public administration here with us today, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce each one of them. So in no particular order, John Kamensky is an emeritus senior fellow at the IBM Center for the Business of Government. Before joining IBM, Professor Kamensky served as the deputy director for Vice President Al Gore's National Partnership for Reinventing Government. And before that, he was at GAO, where he played a key role in the development and passage of the Government Performance and Results Act. He is a fellow at the National Academy of Public Administration and a professor at the UMass Amherst School of Public Policy. Welcome, John. Thank you for being here. Next up, we have Professor Jane Fountain. Professor Fountain is a distinguished professor in the political science and public policy at UMass Amherst. She is the co-founder and the director at the National Center for Digital Government. She is also a fellow and the secretary of the board at the National Academy of Public Administration. She served as the interim director for the Center of Public Policy and Administration, which is now the School of Public Policy, from 2006 to 2007. She was the political science department chair from 2015 to 2018. And now, after 5 years of Professor Al Roberts' wonderful leadership, she will be actually taking over the role as director for the UMass School of Public Policy. And we offer our congratulations, and we are so excited to have her here. So thank you, Jane, for being a part of this panel. Next up, we have Dr. Nancy Augustine. Nancy earned her PhD in public policy and public administration from George Washington University, where she is a professor at the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration. Dr. Augustine is the director for the Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships at the National Academy of Public Administration. And in addition to her work at CIP, she has led several projects for the Academy, for the legislative branch, the Department of Commerce, Office of the Inspector General, and the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. And I am lucky enough to get to work with her on another study during my internship. So thank you, Nancy, for being here. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Joseph Mitchell, who leads the National Academy of Public Administration's Grand Challenges in Public Administration Initiative and the Agile Government Center. He previously led and managed all of the Academy's organizational studies, overseeing all congressionally directed and agency requested studies. And he serves on the National Science Foundation's Business and Operations Advisory Committee. So thank you, Joe, for being here. Now, as I was thinking about how I was going to introduce each of our panelists, I realized that I truly could spend this whole hour just doing a monologue about the accolades and achievements of each of our panelists through their careers in public service. We really are just so lucky to have them here and get to hear from them today. So with that being said, you're not here to hear from me, you're here to hear from them. So I will hand it over to them and welcome them to tell us a little bit more about themselves and how they fit into this conversation around the future of work in government. So thank you, and a big virtual round of applause for being here. And I will pass it off to you all to introduce yourselves. And Joe, can I pick on you to go first?
Absolutely. So first of all, I just wanted to say, this is a really important time to be going into public service, as we'll be talking today. So thank you all for going into this field. Public service is a noble and honorable profession. It's very important. I think it's even more important today in the times that we live in. So as we were talking about, so strategic initiatives at the Academy includes our 12 grand challenges of public administration. We'll talk about one of those on the public service and a little more detail. Our Agile Government Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships that Nancy directs, and a lot of our thought leadership and sponsored initiatives. Just a little bit about the Academy itself. We're a nonprofit organization chartered by Congress to really work on the major issues facing government. We were chartered in 1984, established in 1967. Our vision is a just, fair, and inclusive government that strengthens communities and protects democracy. We're like the National Academy of Sciences in the sense that we're one of only two research institutions with a congressional charter. We are about 100 years younger than them, and we focus on governance and management issues. And we do that through a lot of independent research, engagement with the public, and just really trying to help develop solutions. So we have our grand challenges, which I noted in November 2019, we identified those. There are 12 of those. Jane Fountain was on our steering committee, helped us identify them. And grand challenges are those that are really the biggest issues facing government from a public administration standpoint over the next 10 years. They're large in scope, they're interagency, intersectoral, and intergovernmental. So they're not just one level of government. They require significant innovation and long-term commitment. And also paradigm shifts. And so by addressing these, we think that we can have significant improvements at the individual level, the governmental level, and the societal level. The Academy itself, of course, we're not an operating institution in terms of we're not running government programs. So our role is as an outside group is to inspire action, enhance understanding, connect stakeholders, and really drive change. So we're outside government, but we are working to try to get these grand challenges addressed. And one of those grand challenges that I think is of particular importance for our conversation today is modernize and reinvigorate the public service. I will note that we announced this before the COVID-19 pandemic, but I think that it's all the reasons that we said it was a grand challenge in November of 2019. It's even more so now. And this was because we think that government is increasingly being asked to address really complex and interconnected wicked problems. We need to build a public service that can do that, but obviously we face challenges given our hiring practices, salary flexibilities, a lot of the promotion rules and things do make it challenging for us to build the workforce. And we also have a lot of public employees that are either at retirement age or going to be retiring soon. So we've got to backfill a lot of positions. And in addition, really how we do the public's business has changed over time in terms of being a lot more third-party delivery of a lot of the frontline services. So those were all the reasons we thought that this was a grand challenge. And now I think that in the midst of a global pandemic, it's even more so. And really the future of work, as I know John is going to talk about, has fundamentally changed. And I think that the workplace is a very different place today than it was 3 years ago. I don't think we're going to have a turnkey operation and just turn it back to what it was. So the workplace that you're joining is a very different place than it was even just 3 years ago. And so these issues, I think, have become even more important. But that's a little bit of background about the Academy and maybe some framing of the conversation. I know John will be talking a lot more in detail about the future of work. So we'll all be commenting on that, but that's a little bit for me. So back over to you, Lizzie.
Thank you so much, Joe. Yes, that did a great job of exactly. We are going to be going into a post-pandemic world. So we need to know what we're getting ourselves into. And your research is helping us to do that. So I am going to pass it over to Nancy, if I may, to introduce herself and talk a little bit about her work at the Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships.
Thank you, Lizzie. So Joe is the Director of Strategic Initiatives, and the Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships, which I'm leading, is part of Strategic Initiatives. So just to give you just to connect those dots a little bit. So the Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships was formed last fall by the National Academy of Public Administration to focus on the often overlooked aspects of how different levels of government work together. So we have come to be focused on state and local implementation of federal programs and policies, particularly dealing with this recurring theme that so often federal policies and programs are set up, designed, and implemented without really thinking or understanding how state and local governments operate. And sometimes states are able to figure it out, states and local governments, and sometimes it makes a real mess. So we're trying to find opportunities for dialogue to solve problems as we can. We're a very small group, so we have to keep our aspirations in bounds. But this is precisely where we're working. So workforce is absolutely an intergovernmental issue. And I'll give you an example of a meeting that we had in February. So I mentioned we do a lot of convenings, and we had a group of people together to talk about the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Federal, state, local, US Chamber of Commerce representing private sector interests, all coming in to talk specifically about the workforce issues. So you're probably aware of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So it's over $1 trillion. $500 billion is new funding. The other half, almost $500 billion, is reauthorization of existing programs. And this is all supposed to go out in the next 3, 4, 5 years. So who is going to do the work? So there are the construction worker issue is one thing. We already have a shortage of tradespeople, but at the state and local level, we're in a real crunch because, as we'll come to talk about a little bit later, state and local governments are having terrible hiring problems right now, and people are fleeing to go to the public sector. So what happens then? State and local people have to be there to develop the plans, to develop the designs, to let the contracts, to monitor the contracts. They need a lot of people in order to make this happen. And if they're not there, then it's not going to move forward very effectively. So I'll talk a little bit more later on about state and local woes and hiring, but for now, I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Nancy. And I will pass it over to Jane.
I see a lot of familiar faces, so good to see your names and to be here. And I'm really honored to be on the panel. I want to echo Joe and Nancy, of course, on the tremendous need for young people, all people actually, to become involved in public service, particularly on the sort of permanent or professional side. Another way to think of a tremendous need is a tremendous opportunity. And maybe this will be a little bit Kennedy-esque in that there would be, my dream would be there would be a great resurgence with many, many people of your generation, many of you, becoming involved in public service. It's easy for me to say because I'm surrounded with people who want to enter public and nonprofit service all the time. In my role as a faculty member, I'll just say by way of introduction, not only is it our job to engage in research, and of course there are many other research arenas and institutions, including IBM Center for Business and Government, which has been a great catalyst for academic research, but also to think about what is the future for public affairs education, so that not only are students and graduates motivated to go into public service, but they have the tools, they have the perspective, they have the skills that they need. There's a new report on agile and public affairs education. So people at NAPA and connected with the National Academy and others are working on that, but we have a long way to go. I will end by saying the part of what I found so exciting about the student organization of the ICMA is not only the training, socialization, exposure that you all get, but again, thinking of kind of multiple meanings here and perspectives. You all bring us perspective and a fresh set of eyes to problems that many of us working on these things for decades simply cannot see anymore, in part because we may be so close to the problem, we're drawing on such past experience, the we see things you can't see for sure, but we really need the fresh set of eyes, new generation to step into these problems, bringing your perspectives and skills. So I'm very happy to be here.
And we are thrilled to have you. And I will say, as your student, we are being trained very well. And I will say we are lucky enough to also have John Kamensky, who I have also been lucky enough to be a student of as he embarks on his professorial career. So I would like to hand the mic over to him. And I will also just in a moment share his slides once he introduces himself, as he's offered to give us a short presentation on some expectations for the challenges we can expect.
Well, thank you very much, Lizzie. Since I've retired, I've had a little bit more free time, and I spent some of it obviously on Twitter. And I just recently saw a post by a professor on Twitter, and she had her first in-person lecture in the past 2 years. And turns out that 90% of the students in her grad class had never been in an in-person lecture. And at the end of the lecture, they all waved goodbye, just like on Zoom. And I'm wondering, is that what the future of government is going to look like? So I don't know. I have some slides, and what I'll do is use them basically to help frame the next few minutes here. What I want to do is talk a little bit about how government agencies are rethinking how work gets done, both federal, state, and local. And then 6 challenges that managers are going to have to overcome in order to create this future of work. So agencies are across the government are rethinking how work gets done. And this is not something that's new. Digital transformation has been a buzzword for probably the past decade. And I saw that especially working in a private sector company. But now both public and private sector companies are facing with doing this. And that means that meeting with citizens in person is not always an option for service delivery. It's moving from basically in-person identity to how do you go about creating digital identities for citizens. In fact, this whole movement, something that GAO recently did a study looking at about a dozen trends that are going to affect American society in the coming decade. And this is one of those dozen trends. It includes where and how we work. And the interesting thing is the pandemic, in a way, did a fast forward of about 3 to 5 years in this evolution. And during the pandemic, work shifted to remote locations from about 20% to about 70% for a lot of service delivery. And this, of course, triggered changes in things like mass transit demand, office vacancies, shifting people from working in urban centers, and new expectations for employees with a work from anywhere mindset. At the federal government, EPA had a long-term IT modernization effort underway in 1920, which kind of 2020 that created a technological foundation to make this transition to distance work much more feasible and reliable. And the question is that can it develop and discuss and deliver permits and environmental impact statements digitally? And can field work and streams and wetlands be done via drones or the Internet of Things, as opposed to people going out and wading into the waters to figure out? And what about the public hearings and regulatory reviews? Can these be done remotely as opposed to in person? So these are things that EPA is grappling with as to how does it change the way it does its work. NASA is another agency. I thought it was interesting that the Mars lander that was done a couple years ago was largely done from scientists' living rooms. And its leadership had this engagement and data from its past telework experiences. And then so the SpaceX launch was on track, and scientists were able to do this launch and engage from it mostly from home. And in the Office of Personnel Management, large multi-day in-person meetings shifted to largely online efforts, there were fewer hours and actually more participation through online tools. So they actually found it beneficial and much more efficient and effective to do stuff. At the state level, some state agencies promoted telework pre-COVID, and so they were able to make the shift more readily. For example, the California Department of Motor Vehicles began driver tests online. And last year, California state court hearings went virtual for the first time. A law professor at UC Hastings in San Francisco, Alice Armitage, said this pandemic will open everybody's eyes and get people to move out of their silos. About a dozen state legislatures, including New York, have made provisions to convene and vote remotely. The New York State Department of Labor created a tech surge to address its unemployment insurance claims in 2020, 2021. And because of the UI claims backlog at the time, that people were being sent home. And they began using AI-assisted call centers and robotic process automation and moved to the cloud. So this was a huge step forward. So a lot of states invested COVID relief funds in the infrastructure needed for telework in the first few months of the pandemic, both in machines as well as connectivity. Local governments typically tended to be less prepared at the initial onset of distant work mandates. Only about half of local government tech officials said their organizations were ready to distribute laptops and mobile devices so that employees could work at home. But some local governments took the opportunity to change their operating procedures. For example, Waukesha County in Wisconsin streamlined its permitting process for real estate developers and made it completely an online experience. Things that like stormwater and road design and environmental impact statements and all that used to require multiple in-person meetings and coordination between different departments now are happening online, and they said they'll probably never go back. So a lot of this was, in a way, a wake-up call of how do you move forward. ICMA did a survey back in September 2020. I haven't been able to get a hold of more current data, but if you look at this, you'll see that this notion of reverting back to pre-pandemic practices seems to be fairly low, that there would be at least the adoption of more of a hybrid approach. The 6 challenges that were identified in an IBM Center report that will be in the resources section at the end of this presentation are that, first of all, the hybrid work environments are going to be far more challenging than either in office or remote only, because you have to consciously avoid the inadvertent creation of an in-group or an out-group of employees. And making remote work fair means that you have to consciously, as a manager, think through how this is going to be done, because in the past, people that were offsite tended to be promoted at half the rate that their peers were who were in office. So part of this is to how do you nudge people that tend to come into the office and have them actually work from home so that it becomes much more of an equitable thing. And this is setting minimum and maximum standards for remote work. But the second is tech equity is obviously a straightforward thing. And equal treatment. Not everybody lives in locations that have good connectivity, or their home equipment might not support the higher bandwidth that are needed for video conferencing. So the office needs to consciously factor that in and provide for this kind of. In the corporate world, there's a lot of parallel investment and continuous learning systems. And they're beginning to use the use of augmented reality and virtual reality tools to improve both communications and collaboration, as well as in training. This new team work routines is something that you have to make as a manager a much more intentional approach to making their work more visible to colleagues through the use of common sharing platforms like Trello or Slack and Mural. These platforms allow individual workers to see what everybody is doing in a joint project, as well as the manager. And this actually gives people more autonomy to work in their corner of the project, so their peers can sort of see what the bigger picture is and how their individual contributions fit in. This is obviously going to be moving more towards a paperless world. And so the new tech tools mean that people can be contacted during defined work hours. And in addition, meetings and workshops need to be organized more in advance with clear objectives and read aheads, et cetera, and have a facilitator. The fourth is managing intentionally. They have to focus on, managers have to focus on outputs because they can't see effort. And this is a shift for a lot of managers. But Glenn Dirks of Teletrips, who studied this, said managing in itself really doesn't change that much. Managers just have to accept their responsibilities for being a good manager, which for me means defining the work that has to be done, assigning the work to the right people, setting clear performance goals, and then holding people accountable for getting it done. That means basically the more you go virtual, the more the quality of management matters. In the fifth area step, preserving and creating interpersonal ties, distant work involves a culture change for managers. They have to trust their workers to do the right thing and empower them with the information, the training, and the tools to do it. And then finally, developing and promoting an organizational culture. Culture is about the decisions and values about how we work together, how we talk to our customers, how we talk with each other, and how much time we spend at work. And it's assumed that teammates who work close to each other will naturally and inevitably develop a culture of their own. There's three important ingredients for building a culture in a remote workforce. First of all, there's teams. Second is tools. And the third is process. So these 6 challenges are not insurmountable, as can be seen by the various organizations I mentioned earlier that have made the transition, but it does require conscious and committed leadership and good management efforts. There's a series of reports that the IBM Center has published in the past couple years around this. And Lizzie, I'm guessing that this being recorded is that people can go to those reports on our website. With that, let me stop and turn to discussion.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation. I was particularly struck, by what you said about how there are certain groups that have, switched to online meetings and decided that they're just never going back. And I think that's what a lot of us students have realized as we get more and more used to online Zoom meetings and Teams meetings, that the ease and the fact that I can work with these folks down in Washington, D.C. is so useful that it really is never going to leave us. So I would like to give our panelists a chance to respond to the presentation and talk a little bit more about their expertise. So I will give it off to our panelists.
We should have decided ahead of time who was going to go first. So I don't mind going first. So I'm going to start with an obvious statement, is that of course the last 2 years have been massive disruption, obviously, and we hear about it. The news is saturated with all of the forms of disruption, but the disruption to state and local government is flying a little bit under the radar screen. So Lizzie mentioned I teach at the Trachtenberg School, and one thing that I come back to again and again when we have a big event, a massive disruption of some kind, we can't say right away whether this is a blip or if this is change in trajectory. So it's important to reflect on and think about what's going on now in order to kind of prepare ourselves mentally for what may be coming. So in that spirit, public sector workers, of course, have been bent to the point of breaking. We certainly have heard plenty about public health officials who both have incredible volumes of work and have been under lots of fire because because a lot of people don't agree. Some people don't agree with how they've chosen to set policy in their states and in their localities. Another big strain on state and local government has been the new ways to deliver services. We were just talking about online meetings, and Lizzie, I'll agree with you. In the before times, no way would I have been able to participate in this kind of a forum. Because you would have been meeting in person, but now we've crossed a threshold. We have meetings on Zoom, which is a terrific thing. But getting there has been a struggle, and particularly state and local governments. This is actually something that I've been trying to get to the bottom of. They've had to do an awful lot of work. Now, it's a good thing, but they've had to create in a hurry more flexible ways for citizens to access services. They've had to create or expand their online portals. In some cases, they've had to change up or delay or defer or waive various licensing and certification requirements. So, many of those good things, that additional flexibility, now that it's in place, I think we can count on it sticking. So that is certainly a good thing. Another way that state and local governments have been really taxed is in managing all the COVID relief and recovery funds. So some of I won't go too far down this path, but some of the COVID relief and recovery funds went through existing programs. A huge mass of money through existing programs, but existing programs nonetheless. So, your public administration, public policy, public affairs folks, you can understand an existing program, existing relationships. You have processes set up for dealing with it, processes for allocating funds, recording, accountability, and so forth. But some of these funds went through new channels. And as a result, state and local governments had to set up a lot of processes and a lot of procedures in a hurry. They had to hire staff. Many of them hired consultants, which of course need to be managed and overseen, and the contracts have to be managed and overseen. And they had to figure out how to be accountable to the federal government with initially very little guidance. They had to just come up with their best ideas on how to be accountable for all of these massive funds that they received. It was truly overwhelming for some of the smaller communities. So those are kind of like the three big issues right now. So I mentioned that this is something I'm trying to get to the bottom of. I don't know that anybody is really monitoring this issue. So there are lots of anecdotes I've seen. It absolutely makes sense, but we don't know as a point of fact of how big or widespread this problem is. I'm going with, I've heard the stories and it sure makes sense to me. So I will claim that it's a big problem. A couple of Napa fellows, Catherine Barrett and Richard Green, have written about on some of these anecdotes in Route 50. And parenthetically, those of you who are interested in state and local government, you really ought to subscribe to Route 50. It's free, and it talks about a lot of interesting stuff going on at the state and local level. But in any case, they've been able to find some particular anecdotes. So, for instance, the North Carolina prison system has 20% vacancies. 20% vacancies. Arizona Highway Patrol also has 20% vacancies. So what are states and local governments doing about this? So they're trying a number of things. They're giving some large pay hikes. And I will say, this is before the inflationary pressures kicked in. So these were real pay hikes. So Kansas, Florida, Missouri all offered more than 5% pay hikes. Alaska, Nebraska, Florida, Virginia implemented signing bonuses in order to try to get people in the door. And there are many, many examples of skilled trade workers, public health workers, a combination of increased salary and signing bonuses and retention bonuses in order to try to get them. So what's the takeaway for you? So great time to be entering the public service. You went down this path because you've got a public service motivation. You care and you want to make the world a better place. And boy, oh boy, are you needed. I can't say what your particular opportunities will be, but state and local government in many places is under a lot of strain. So pass it off to the next person.
Great. Well, thank you, Nancy. So I completely agree with Nancy's perspective. I wanted to note back, so going back to some of John's, the 6 challenges, the whole notion of the hybrid work environment. I do think it's important to realize that there's still going to be work. It has been work, and there will still be work that really needs to be done in person. So even during the height of the pandemic, about half of all federal employees at the federal level were not teleworking. If you think about people like mail carriers and health and safety inspectors, scientists in a lab, those people that really are having to do things in person. If you're providing medical care in a veterans hospital, for example, you're really doing that in person. So obviously, it's just important to note that, because a lot of times I've been on these panels and everybody's teleworking and it's kind of the assumption is like that everybody's going to be able to do that. But the reality is people are not always able to do that. So it really will be very much like a hybrid work model. I think for the people that can telework, I think the interesting thing is that, yes, it requires different management skills, but it's also a real opportunity, because I think that when you have remote work, what I've certainly found as a leader and a manager is, the only thing you really have to evaluate people on is the outcome, is what are they actually producing. And so I think that there's a transparency that you get by the remote work that you didn't necessarily have before. And so you can really kind of see what's the value along the chain, what's happening. And then certainly over time, you can reshape the workforce as needed. So you can say, hey, as people retire or move on to another position, you don't always have to backfill that particular position. And so I think that managers have an opportunity to really learn more about the work that's actually being done. And so there's an opportunity through this new world of work, I think, to kind of delayer. So Paul Light, a scholar of public administration back in the 90s, wrote about thickening government. And so I think that this is a way, of really addressing that. But again, as John noted, I think that it does require, really leaders and managers to do things differently, to be much more outcome focused, and certainly in terms of preserving the interpersonal ties and the trust. There are a wide range of things that you can do, such as having all staff meetings that at a certain time that everybody comes together. It's great in terms of Zoom being able to do these breakout groups. That's it's kind of like you're trying to simulate that being in the office, but I think it does require different ways of doing things, but I think that it will allow us to hopefully figure out what's the value of the work, what can we get rid of, what don't we need. I also think that decisions about the future of work do need to be thought of in an intergovernmental context. I live in Washington, D.C., and so the decisions that the federal government makes in terms of whether people have to be in the office and for how long really does impact this area, because the city, the businesses and so forth are dependent on that. So I think that you need to think about this in terms of future of work, but what the decisions that are made at one level of government are going to impact other levels of government. So I think that's something you should consider. And then the last kind of piece I would say is I do think that this has an opportunity to let us be more agile. We have an Agile Government Center, and essentially Agile is all about being more responsive to your customers. And yes, even in the public sector, we do have customers, we have stakeholders, and working in a more networked kind of iterative way. And so working in teams, iterating on something, letting people who are your users, your customers, give you feedback. So I do think that kind of it's easier now in this new world of work to do that. So certainly consider how to be more agile moving forward. So those are just some thoughts that I had. But I do think that you all have a great opportunity, and certainly as people who are joining the workforce, I think that your leaders and managers are going to be looking to you. You have a lot of the skills of how to work in this environment. So I think you can help everybody, kind of build the culture of collaboration that's needed in this new world of work. So those are just a few thoughts I had. Jane, over to you.
It's a great. For many of you who have been in my classes, some of what I'll say won't be new, but maybe it'll come in a somewhat different framing that'll be valuable to you. And just to put a pin in just a couple of ideas so far, when I first began thinking about future of work, it was much more in terms of substitution and whose jobs would be lost. And I think you see that, yes, there is some substitution of technology for labor, but there's, especially at the professional levels, a lot of complementarity between tools and work. And some of these kind of micro changes are things that we barely notice. We take a period of time to become familiar with a new tool or a new platform. We're changing the way we're working, but we're not necessarily really thinking about it that way. And that will continue because I do think there's we're in the early stages of development of what we used to call computer-supported cooperative work a million years ago, and we're still really undergoing fairly rapid development, especially as John mentioned, with Internet of Things, virtual reality, AI, big data. So we keep layering on emerging technologies, applications, and then feeding those into how we design and do work. So this is something that keeps moving. It doesn't reach some endpoint where we can just all, sort of stop and return to some static environment. And similarly, yes, it's true that COVID was a major catalyst in moving processes online, work, meetings, many things into an online environment. But noting, as Joe said, that there are many, many people who did not and still don't participate in these online environments and platforms. They are very much in a physical work world and are going to remain there. Because of the importance of resilience, because of the fact that COVID is not the last pandemic. I don't want to be pessimistic, but if you read any of the work in this area, we need to be prepared for either climate or weather-related disruptions, other types of disruptions, including health and medical disruptions. So the idea that we would revert back to the status quo is just not going to prepare us for the future. So we talked a lot about changing work. I want to, in the interest of time, we'll sort of move more quickly here, but talk about changing workers, and especially because of this group, there are human skills that go with developing agile, that go with developing greater intergovernmental, federal, state, local, international, tribal, community, networked relationships that are really vital. John mentioned organizational culture. Technologies alone never change organizational culture. It's really the people and the management and the agreements that are made. Most of these technologies are not plug and play. You can't just drop them in. There's a fairly arduous effort at not adoption, but implementation and enactment. So first, professionals really need to be skilled at what people in organizational behavior call emotional labor. And this is not nursing and healthcare. This is the labor that goes into supporting and managing and serving people, either clients, customers, as well as coworkers, the people who work sort of for us and in our organizations. Part of that includes what in design thinking has been called deep empathy or radical empathy, which are these very soft but incredibly important skills of active listening, being able to put oneself in the shoes of various stakeholders. If we're dealing with more and different stakeholders, we really have to understand not just their interests and their costs and benefits, but really where they're coming from, what will work for them, what won't work for them. And that involves a great deal of being able to put yourself in another person's shoes, so to speak. The second skill or area of skill is in cross-boundary relationships, building them, managing them, whether it's at the kind of micro level in teams or more broadly in networks. And as we're working virtually and working across federal, state, local, that's a very big management lift and entails a great deal of skill. And these are, I say skill because these are things that can be learned, they can be trained, they can be practiced, they can be improved. And that's exactly the way we should be approaching them. And included here are motivating different stakeholders, persuasion, negotiation, problem solving, deliberation, coming up with new ideas, something that may be out of the box, but seems to be something that will work in a particular situation, and then being able to build support for those ideas so that you can sustain collaborative efforts. And then the third thing that it's a bit ironic that machine learning, lots of algorithms are built on data from the past. And like all models, they're meant to help us look into the future, but sometimes they're not very helpful because when the past can be a drag in terms of the data we're working with on particularly turbulent environments and disruptive change. And it really is the humans and the professionals who need to have this orientation toward the future and a strategic management orientation, an ability to think ahead. So using AI for early warning systems can be enormously helpful, seeing something emerging before it's actually happening in an emergency, but it really then requires the sort of management ability to figure out what will we do about that? What are we doing to prepare ourselves? So I'll end with what others have said. This is an incredibly exciting time, as well as an important time to engage in public service and in governance. So happy we're having this panel.
Thank you so much for all of your responses. I was so happy, Jane, that you brought up that piece about skills, because I was reflecting from what Joe said about and Nancy, that we are missing workers. But I was thinking, yes, but we're missing specific workers with specific skill sets that can be learned and can be trained. So I really appreciate that you brought that up. Now we've got about 10 minutes left together. So I'd like to open it up to questions. I see we have one question in the chat already. And so I'll start with that one. And then afterwards, if people have questions, they can put them in the chat or raise their hands and I will call on folks. So we'll start out with, how can governments ensure that preparedness efforts are inclusive and that no one is left behind?
So, Lizzie, I'm happy to start on that. It's interesting. This question raised is actually two grand challenges in one. We have a grand challenge on foster social equity, and we also have a grand challenge on build resilient communities. And so I think that part of this is being really conscious that you need to take both an intergovernmental and an intersectoral approach. So if you're looking at preparedness, it's not sufficient to just say to look at it in a silo. And you really need, as public administrators, to bring together, a diverse array of, public, nonprofit, and private sector organizations. And so bringing people together, developing the strategies, implementing the programs are critical. I think from a social equity standpoint, in particular, in terms of citizen engagement, it's necessary to engage in a variety of ways, as we're talking about. Some people really have the internet connectivity and so forth, and the time and the flexibility to be able to engage remotely, but not everyone does. So I think that when you're thinking about your engagement strategy, it can't all just be online engagement, because you're going to then be missing some people. So you've got to make sure that you have inclusive engagement strategies. And then social equity in general, I think that, as administrators, you have to work in partnership with your elected officials, with the policymakers, and then you also have to be willing to exercise lawful discretion. So where you do have discretion to try to promote equity in terms of how you're engaging in preparedness and other activities. So a lot of this is it's a mindset issue, and it's also use the tools that are available to you issue.
I've got a little contribution to that. And that is that the ability to do things virtually actually creates an opportunity for more inclusion. Inclusion with citizens, for example, in community hearings, or listening in on what's going on in the city council. With your organizational partners, you can engage with them with lower barriers, because you can just quickly reach out. And then there's this whole notion of affordability. I've got an international conference next week. I do not have to fly somewhere. People from all over the world do not have to come. And so people are able to participate in things that they would have been unaffordable, either because of the time or the cost of doing these kinds of things. I thought it was interesting with Biden's transition team that they were able to engage people in California and other places to be on the team that they would not have done otherwise, because traditionally it had always been in-person transition teams. So this whole notion of engaging and being able to be more accessible, I think, is an important element of this. I saw this at IBM. We were able to, it was a global company. We had 300,000 employees, and we had people in over 100 different countries. And you were able to create teams and work together across boundaries because the talent that was needed was either in India or in Finland or something like that. And you were able to get things done. So I think that's really an opportunity, actually.
This issue of equity is quite real, and for those of you who have been following it, the work done by Brookings Institution, really great, meticulous analysis in this area, as well as the MIT Future of Work group, and others, McKinsey, Deloitte, et cetera. About 30% of the workforce, the predictions are, will face severe disruption, job loss, because of technological change. And for a long time, I remember in the Clinton administration, when about 250, John will remember this well, about 250 middle-level civil servants who were middle managers lost their positions. And it was part of, I'm going to make an hourglass with my hands here, and it's this missing middle. So we have more and more bifurcated workforce where professionals will figure it out. We have a lot to do, a lot to learn, but we'll be fine. Those who are at the bottom and increasingly working across this kind of chasm represents an area that we really need to pay attention to. There are many, many different policy recommendations in place. Some of them, as you can imagine, involve reskilling, changing vocational education, job training, et cetera, providing supports, influencing employers to pick up more of the cost of this kind of training and adaptation. Many firms already do that and build it just into the price of doing business. They're constantly retraining their workforce. It's harder, and I'm sure Nancy can speak to this, to do that if you're a state and local government, and they vary as well in the wealth that they have. So this issue of fostering social equity has so many different entailments to it. It's quite important. And let me, I don't want to take too much time. There's a movement afoot, and it has a lot of validity to it, that many jobs that require right now a bachelor's degree, or let me be really provocative here, a master's degree. Many people are saying, well, maybe we could just do this with a certificate or some very precise training, and people would credential themselves in precise ways. It's hard for me to imagine that could match. Of course, I'm heavily invested in a public affairs master's with everything that goes with that, but it's something that we will, people are looking at and exploring.
Would anyone else like to respond, or shall we move on to the next question?
Next question.
Okay. All right, I would love to give Mary Accardi a chance to speak if she would like to.
Great, good morning, or actually good afternoon. I'm so happy to be able to be on this call. I'm an alum way back from the MPA program in 1991 with Dr. Mainzer, Dr. Booth, Dr. Kramer, so I'm really dating myself, and I don't often have time to jump on these calls. But I saw the topic, and I lead the HR practice for the Collins Center for Public Management at the McCormick School in Boston. And our whole mission is to work with cities and towns and some state agencies. So I just can't reiterate enough what the panel has said about the workforce and getting into local government. I'm gonna channel Dr. Booth and go with local government. It is such a great opportunity for recent students to get involved. So that's just my pitch. I'm not looking you to give me any work, but I want to encourage you to look for internships in local government. There's a desperate need. They are great careers. I myself have had a career in municipal HR, and now I do consulting with cities and towns. And whether it's the Collins Center, the Donahue Institute, get some experience working in local government, and you will be addicted like the rest of us are. So congratulations and good luck.
Thank you, Mary. I can definitely reiterate that I think everyone in this program has caught the local and federal government bug, and we are very happy to be in this career field.
I asked a question of Mary. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, excuse me, John. No, go ahead.
I was going to ask a question of Mary. Have you seen how a sea change in employee expectations is that people say, I want to work virtually or want to work hybrid, and do execs have to rethink how they recruit and manage and empower their employees from the experience that you've had from your angle?
Sure. We do a lot of executive recruitments for town managers. We definitely see that. We see a definite push for the work-life balance. People are leaving their jobs because of it, because they can find that job that's going to be 1 day a week hybrid. And it is a great market to be in if you want to go into local government administration. As you mentioned, the pay is increasing. There are many more models of hybrid these days. People like to be, I'm HR, I like to be with people, but there are the balances, and the realities are some of the COVID has taught us we don't always have to do it that way. And there's an issue going on with the collective bargaining units as well. There's a lot of bargaining around some of those things. And then you have the haves and have-nots, as was mentioned. So I think it's a moving target, quite frankly.
Oh, well, I was just going to reinforce what Mary is saying about how great it is to work in local government. I spent my first 10 years working in counties in Virginia. And by happenstance, I went to work for a county government that was a little bit on the small side. I was in urban planning. We were an office of about 10. When you're in a smaller but not tiny community, even as an entry-level person, you get to be a jack of all trades. You get to have such a wide variety of experience because there's really nobody else to do it. So at age 24, I was representing the county at the Washington, D.C. area MPO on transportation matters because there was nobody else to do it. So it's truly a wonderful experience.
Well, thank you all. So we've just hit over the 12:30 mark, and I know that we have some very busy panelists that have taken their time out to join us today. I am so thankful to all of you, both to get to work with you in my public policy degree, and to have you all get to share your expertise with this panel. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our audience members for coming. It was so nice to see so many friendly names up there. I encourage you to reach out if you have any questions. And this has been recorded and will be shared. So please reach out if you would like any information about it. And I'll also make sure to share it. So with that, thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.